Let us begin the presidential plenary. My name is Gary Langham. I'm the executive director at the AAG, and it is a delight to be here with you. I first got this job in 2019. We were supposed to be here in person in 2020 for that annual meeting, but of course, you know what happened, but here we are 4 years later, finally together. And, yes. And that has just been terrific. So we've been through a pandemic, and we've also at AAG just been completing some once-in-a-generation changes in infrastructure that I'd like to tell you a little bit about. So let me do that. So not long after I started, 6 months in fact, of course we all had the pandemic, and they say in a crisis you can learn a lot about a person or a group of people, and I learned a lot about you during that crisis. What I learned was, after everything started happening, we might reasonably have just kind of hunkered down and waited to see what would happen. But that was not your inclination or reaction. The membership really rose to the occasion when we launched this COVID-19 Rapid Response Task Force, and dozens and dozens of members took part and created 34 proposals for how to help their fellow geographers through the pandemic. From that list of 34, a blue ribbon panel selected 9, and then the AAG Council funded 2 years of those 9 programs. And it was really at that point that I knew I had done the right thing in taking this job, and that I was just so honored to be with folks whose first inclination was to help each other and do good in the world. So a little bit about, over these last 3 years, since I haven't had a chance to address you, some of the changes that have happened at AAG. So first is about renewal. As you, I'm sure, have noticed, we have a brand new, shiny website. It is also underpinned with an excellent database. Can't really see that, but it enables some amazing technology for us. And then after 50 years of being at Meridian Place, we have moved into some new headquarters on Pennsylvania Avenue, right across the street from the White House. What's exciting about that is, yes, thank you. What's exciting about that is we have a brand new modern space that is fully accessible, and it is LEED Gold standard. So that is great. And we've also had climate change on our mind, and we have done a lot in just a few years. We have, at this point, we're 100% fully divested from fossil fuels in all of AAG's investments. And they're actually doing well in the market too. We have experimented with virtual meetings these past 3 years, which is enabling us to have our very first hybrid meeting here in Denver. There are 16% of all the sessions, the 1,330 sessions, are fully hybrid, and 65% are streamed out. Many more will be recorded and shared after the fact. I mentioned the LEED Gold headquarters. And then a year or so ago, we completed a study on our carbon footprint for meetings like this, because this is all on our mind. So we went back and used a method to measure everyone's flight for 10 years worth of meetings to establish a baseline. How much carbon do we think we're generating when we have a meeting like this? And this will allow us to measure going forward how good a job we're doing of meeting the council's goal of a 45% reduction in our carbon footprint at meetings like this by 2030. So not too long after this meeting, I'll have that first comparison against that benchmark. And then membership, of course, not surprisingly, during the pandemic, declined a little bit, particularly among members that were making $75,000 or less. Naturally, they're likely to be more impacted by what had happened. But I'm very pleased to tell you that 2 years running now, the membership is rising again, and we really look forward to the future there. We've also been busy on a new strategic plan. So as represented by this symbol here, it has 8 different pillars, and I hope you'll notice that in the center of that pillar is justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And tonight, I'm going to announce a brand new program stemming from this. It's going to go live. Let's see, where's Becky? I think it's going to go live right as I say this so that you can apply. So let me tell you a little bit about Elevate the Discipline. This is a brand new program that helps geographers connect their academic work to the public domain. So that could be media, it could be policy advocacy, it could be working with journalists, as we heard in the last session, lots of ways like that. So we get trained, years and years in academia, we get trained in these things. We don't usually get trained in how to write an op-ed or how to do a TV interview. And these are all learnable skills, and we want to help provide that. So we're going to do that in 3 different tiers in order to reach all members in slightly different ways. One way we're going to do it is through a resource hub, and that is live right now on the website. Yes, thank you, Eddie. And so there's all kinds of materials up there that can say like, oh, I know there's a way to write an op-ed. What is that? You can look it up as you're trying to use it. It'll always be there for members. Over time, we're going to build it out. There'll be dozens and dozens of documents on there. During the pandemic, we also got really good at doing virtual webinars. As you probably know, we did many last year. We did 115 webinars last year. So we now have year-round programming. Starting next year, we're going to offer webinars on this topic. So you could sign up if you're a member, and you can learn more about how to engage with the media, how to convert your work more effectively into advocacy and things like that. And then last but not least, for 12 to 15 of the members, we're going to have the first ever cohort. And this is going to be a very intensive training program where you apply. If you're selected, we'll bring you to DC for an intensive training week. You'll have the fellowship of the other cohort fellows, and you'll be able to work on your skills together and then help mentor subsequent cohorts. So the very first cohort as selected, the theme of the cohort as selected by the council this year is climate change and society. So if you work in anything that could be considered climate change and society, and any of this sounds interesting to you, I would encourage you to go online at our website and consider applying. Applications are due on May 5th. We're really excited by this program. We think it's going to help so many ways to showcase all the good work that you do, not only for your own career, but also to help in the minds of the public understand more about why geography is so vital and so important for solving the world's most pressing issues. Any member is eligible. Go online to see all the details. Thank you. Okay, now, for 3 other pillars, I'm very, very pleased to introduce our brand new Director of Diversity and Inclusion, Dr. Risha Berry.
Well, good evening, and thank you so much, Dr. Langham. I am thrilled to join the AAG, and I wish to say welcome to everyone. Thank you, Madam President and members of council, task force committees, our JEDI co-chairs, Dr. Nagel and Dr. Wan Yu. I've had the distinctive opportunity to join a group of 27 individuals that make up the work of the AAG. Thank you so much, staff, for your commitment. And thank you, members. I'd like to greet you with a Zulu greeting, Sabubona. That greeting means I see you. Representation in this discipline matters. We aim to be seen in our identities and intersectionalities. Please look at the person next to you and greet them with Sawubona. I see you. Sawubona. Thank you. Our aim with the strategic plan is to operationalize 32 points in those objectives that creates opportunities to be uplifted and valued. Please stand if you've joined our call to action. No pressure. This means you need to go to the JEDI booth. Thank you so much. So join a working group. Share your perspective. Scan your QR code. This is not intended to be extractive work, but the work of the 6,000 that are represented here and the larger work of our 9,000 members. To ensure that we are seen. We will change governance in the way that we implement policies, practices, and procedures to be more inclusive of our JEDI objectives. We will ensure that our members are representative and that we will remove obstructive barriers to their representation. We will document our progress through reports and metrics that inform a JEDI dashboard. And through communication, we will ensure communication loops that are continuous in feedback. There are also opportunities that we will extend training throughout our continuum or our webbing of our ecology in the discipline. We will also promote advocacy through statements and acts of activism aimed at inclusion. And finally, last but not least, we will focus on listening, the act of listening and engaging with each and every one of our members and the communities that we represent. So please, at this point, if you haven't done so, join our call to action. And now, without further delay, I have the distinct opportunity to introduce Madam President, Dr. Marilyn Raphael. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming to what we hope will be a time of sharing ideas and stimulating conversations. I'm especially excited about the theme of this year's plenary. It is, as you know, towards a just geography, and could be read as an outcome of the platform that I ran on, equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. But if you think of recent presidential projects, think about Amy Lobbins' focus on accessibility, Emily Ye's focus on climate action, the years spent on developing the JEDI strategic plan that you just heard about, and the fact that it's now being implemented, one realizes that this theme brings together ideas, actions that the AAG organization and you, AAG members, have been working on or working with for some time. They all have to be considered within the context of a just geography. I'll express the hope now that we will all walk away from here inspired to continue to work towards a more just geography. Our panel consists of 3 geographers at different stages of their careers. They will reflect on different aspects of a just geography. These geographers, Guillermo Douglass-Jaimes, Assistant Professor at Pomona College, Tianna Bruno, postdoc at University of Texas at Austin, and Kelly Kay, brand new Associate Professor at UCLA. They do not attempt to take a comprehensive view of what a just geography should look like. Rather, they present 3 different but interconnected facets of what is a multifaceted concept. For example, when he talks, Guillermo will include the spatial and temporal dimensions of justice. Tianna will reflect on the potential of critical physical geography. And Kelly will talk, among other things, on the mentoring of our early career geographers. They will speak with passion, but not with an authoritative voice. Rather, they share ideas, opinions, and directions arising from their own study, experiences, and hopes. The topics discussed will at times dwell on ideas that bring discomfort. We ask that you embrace that discomfort, use it for reflection on why that is and how it might be changed. Our intention is for these discussions to continue beyond the time allotted to the plenary and across all the rest of the days of the meeting. Beginning tomorrow, AAG staff have created a Just Geography conversation space right next to the registration area. Beginning tomorrow, please come, contribute your ideas, and continue the conversation. The panelists will each speak in turn, and when they're finished, that will be followed by a Q&A. We have a lot of time. We have the room after, so don't think you have to rush away. Mics are located around, as you can see, and you can also send your questions forward to be read. There is a virtual audience, and we may be entertaining their questions as well. Whatever we don't answer here, we can continue in the conversation space. And now, our first speaker, Guillermo Douglass-Jaimes.
Good evening. I want to start off by thanking Marilyn Raphael for pushing to create this space for us to contemplate what a just geography is and can be. As Marilyn mentioned, I'm Guillermo Douglass-Jaimes, assistant professor at Pomona College. I'm a queer, cisgendered, first-generation college graduate, most child of immigrants, mostly able-bodied. I live in what is now known as Los Angeles, what has been and continues to be the traditional and ancestral and unceded territories of the Tongva Gabrielino tribes, peoples. As we consider what just geography means, perhaps as geographers, we might consider the question, where is justice located? Oh, where are my slides? Don't I have slides? Next, okay, oh, look, there you go. All right, so where's justice located? Is it a point that we can pinpoint on a map? Can we set an administrative boundary around it? Will it fit neatly in a box? Maybe we can employ some machine learning with greater precision using various tools at geographers' disposal, such as GIS. I teach an introduction to GIS, an introduction to geographic information systems at Pomona College. I'm drawn to the tools of GIS for its power in making legible the innumerable injustices in our world, whether by using maps to answer the questions such as, which came first, people or pollution, as Robert Bullard and Laura Pulido's work, amongst many others, have done. Maps can reveal the infrastructures of whiteness supremacy by shedding light on how the historic processes of redlining continue to dictate how Black, Indigenous, Brown communities, regardless of income and wealth, are overburdened with toxic sites. And as environmental justice scholars have moved to identify where environmental goods are located, we circle back to injustice. Maps by Rachel Marlowe-Frosch and Laura Cushing have revealed the tree canopy coverage, which is known to be protective against the onslaught of increasingly common heat waves by providing the much needed shade, are disproportionately found in wealthier and wider communities. I could go on as there's so much to be gained by using the tools of maps and GIS to render the often ignored injustices legible. And yet, how can we teach how to use the tools of GIS, a tool that is originated in implements of empire and war? Perhaps many of you hear Audre Lorde's caution that the master's tools cannot be used to tear down the master's house. These tools were developed by and for the US military-industrial complex, allowing the US military to target where to drop bombs with greater precision. And the third largest military force in the world, the US police forces, have embraced mapping to identify crime hotspots that reify what has been criminalized, that happens to correspond with Black and Indigenous and Brown communities. GIS tools are often used to pinpoint where to extract resources, though perhaps they're used to limit the impacts on our precious flora and fauna. The concerns I raise are often lumped into categories of ethics, siloed into what Matthew Wilson calls week 10, leaving those of us who recognize that tools, like any other tool, as Paulo Freire argues, are never neutral. And yet face the question, do you even do GIS? Again, thanks to Matthew Wilson and Sarah Elwood. So where's justice, and can it coexist in a GIS classroom? While I could have left behind GIS, I was inspired by increasing efforts of community mapping and participatory mapping and theoretical framings of critical GIS scholars and Black geographers and Latinx geographers, researchers and activists, I was emboldened to reorient my course and make it clear my aims, and thus I began teaching Just GIS. Just GIS, an introduction to social and ecological justice-oriented geographic information systems. I'm fortunate to be at a small liberal arts college where I have leeway for such a long and cumbersome title. But what's with the exclamation point? It almost seems like it should fit in with it should be written in Comic Sans. It's a factorial, which is a mathematical expression of a recursion, that which is defined by a simpler version of itself, such as 5 factorial is equal to 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1, which is equal to 5 times 4 factorial, and so on. Social and ecological injustices display a fractal process, from macro, such as global systems of oppression, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and so many more, where these oppressions operate to the micro scale, where we internalize those oppressions, and every place in between. Yet do these oppressions flow in only one direction, and can they be transformed? Recognizing the complex realities of these social relations requires a more sophisticated understanding of how power is wielded and how examples may emerge that suggest shifting patterns of oppression. To guide our thinking, kyriarchy, a feminist theory, describes oppression within social systems, including but not limited to gender. Schussler-Fiorenza describes kyriarchy as a complex pyramidal system of intersecting multiplicative social and religious structures of superordination and subordination, of ruling oppression. Hierarchical relations of domination are built on elite male property rights as well as on exploitation, dependency, inferiority, and obedience of women, who signify all those who are subordinated. Such hierarchical relations are still today at work in the multiplicative intersectionality of race, class, gender, ethnicity, empire, and the structures of discrimination. In other words, positions of oppression and privilege are situational, contextual, and based on different aspects of identity that are neither static nor mutually exclusive. Guided by the pursuit of social and ecological justice, understanding that environmental, social, and health inequalities are the result of dynamic, interconnected environmental and social systems with deep histories that can be changed, Just GIS attempts to combine a critical pedagogy and ecosocial theory of human health to guide my teaching, both in understanding how social and spatial patterns, determinants differently impact human lives across race, class, gender, and all its identities. Students in environmental analysis courses at Pomona College are taught to engage with questions of difference by understanding how categories of identity and place are constructed, as well as how to present those differences in maps and statistical analyses to highlight the disparities in health and material well-being. These goals further push me to break down the explicit and implicit barriers to and within formalized education. Building on this theoretical framework, such as ecosocial theory, a theoretical framework put forward by Nancy Krieger to explain how health disparities emerge, I decided to focus on our efforts in the classroom and recognize the larger oppressive forces at play, and seek to build within the spheres of our control to create what I call a fractal of justice, one that is bounded within the limits of the classroom while recognizing that the boundaries of our ability to move towards justice are vast. Just GIS builds on critical GIS, which Jack Giesking describes as a reflective assessment, ethics, and critique of geospatial data in GIS algorithms or spatial and analytics, software and hardware selection, design tools and elements, data sources and availability, data structures, and the maps that come from them, with a particular eye towards using GIS on behalf of social justice. Just GIS builds on the tradition of critical pedagogy, where we aim to develop a student-centered approach grounded in anti-racist frameworks, where students can work with this instructor and their peers to develop a collective model of engagement, valuing the contributions of all in the classroom, and allowing for individualized assessments of growth in developing a fluency of complex mix of technological tools and theoretical understandings that undergird GIS. This collaborative learning model invites students to bring their whole selves, where their strengths can shine, in an inclusive and supportive space, where students can reveal their vulnerabilities to make sense of the interdisciplinary, intersectional, and mixed methodological academic terrains where Just GIS sits. Just GIS is utopic. Eduardo Galeano, Uruguayan author, posed, what is the purpose of utopia? It sits off in the distance, but we never reach it. We take 10 steps forward and it recedes 10 steps back. We take 3 steps forward, it recedes 3 steps back. What is the point? He arrived at the journey, a journey that we must do together. Robert Bullard spoke about a marathon of justice to our community of geographers in 2018. He described a sort of relay marathon where each of us is tasked with pursuing justice and passing along our batons to all those we encounter. I know that I will not reach this destination in my lifetime. Martin Luther King Jr. imagined the mountaintop that he would never reach, but could see off in the horizon that contains our hopes and our dreams. And I know that I'm not alone. Those of you in this room give me hope. My students who are in this room give me hope. My colleagues in Latinx geographies give me hope. My co-conspirators in Black geographies give me hope. All of those you here give me hope. I will end this with what you probably have seen so often, the claim that while the arc of the moral universe is long, it bends towards justice. This was posed by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and many others have repeated this phrase. And yet we cannot ignore that justice does not occur on its own. We must work together to get there. So, thank you.
Okay, a little bit shorter. Good evening, everyone. First, thank you so much, Marilyn, for inviting us, and thank you, Guillermo, for those powerful words. I'm very honored to be here with you all this evening and excited to share a few of my thoughts on just geographies as sites of intertwined physical geography and critical geographies of race, and the ways I am approaching this entanglement through critical physical geography. So the burgeoning field of critical physical geography foregrounds environmental science, particularly physical geography, but also advocates for critical attention to the social and historical factors that shape biophysical landscapes. To quote Lev et al.'s 2014 intervention piece that played a major role in launching CPG to where it is today, quote, socio-biophysical landscapes are as much the product of unequal power relations, histories of colonialism, and racial and gender disparities as they are of hydrology, ecology, and climate change, end quote. I want to note that there is some discourse or strife on how CPG differs from political ecology and where one builds on the other. This is a worthy conversation, especially in this room, but it's not what I want to talk about today. Just want to put that forward at the beginning. What I want to consider is what are just geographies, and how can we draw justness into our environmental research? Where do just geographies and physical geography meet? What is just geography when we consider geography the discipline? What questions can we be asking with such crossings in mind? What do we do with the contradictions? CPG's explicit aim to, quote, combine critical attention to power relations with deep knowledge of biophysical science or technology in the service of social and environmental transformation make it an ideal starting point for the conversation that I hope to spur, or rather foreground, this evening. More just geographies are unattainable without the new world-building analytics, frameworks, and practices for decolonization and the abolition of slavery's many afterlives, both social and ecological. They're unattainable without these frameworks, right? So therefore, the question of more just geographies must be informed by theoretical and methodological interventions in decolonial, anti-racist, and subaltern epistemologies and knowledge productions around space and place. In this talk, or in these few moments, I urge us geographers to ask, in what ways can we build on CPG's theory and method through critical analyses of geographies of race to build more just geographies and a more just geography? That includes the relations we build within our institutions, as well as with the communities and lands we work with and in. In my work and collaborations, I draw together analyses of environmental records, specifically dendrochronology, and Black geographies to examine the interrelationship between racial and environmental histories and Black communities facing environmental injustice. Specifically, the interrelationship between the devaluation and precarity of Black life and the contamination, degradation, and climate vulnerability of the biophysical landscapes in which these lives exist. In other words, I am interested in highlighting the ways the legacies of slavery experienced by Black environmental justice communities have manifested biophysically. This is what I consider the biophysical afterlife of slavery. Chattel slavery left social, political, economic entrenchments that linger still over and within environmental politics and relations. Moreover, these social aspects have seeped into ecologies and natural environments around the globe. Scholars have highlighted the ways in which the project of slavery left long-term impacts on soils, vegetation regimes, oceans, and waterways. However, slavery did not solely impact the lands and ecologies that it came into contact with as it maneuvered and settled across the earth. As Black studies and Black geography scholars have indicated, the social impacts of slavery move beyond these temporal and spatial bounds within which slavery was enacted. So too do the ecological impacts. The logics and structures that formulate the social afterlife of slavery also legitimate and naturalize the degradation and decimation of Black ecologies today. This too is the biophysical afterlife of slavery. Sites of environmental racism in particular epitomize this biophysical afterlife of slavery for me. As a scholar focused on anti-Black environmental injustice along the US Gulf Coast, I have focused on the potential for trees to hold histories of contamination in their rings. Various dendrochemical studies, that is the chemical analysis of trees, have found that due to their ability to store contaminants, particularly trace elements within their rings, trees provide a natural archive of contamination history. Furthermore, trees can be used to understand characteristics of past hurricane or tropical cyclone events of particular importance to Gulf Coast communities, whose geography makes them susceptible to these intense hurricane events, which in itself can exacerbate already existing pollution and contamination issues. These tree archives contain not only a deeper history than environmental agency contamination records, but also these natural archives contain a more cumulative record of contamination due to the various entry sites for contaminants, including atmospheric deposition as well as absorption from soil. I specifically am using tree core analysis to examine this racial ecological interrelationship. However, my collaborators, like Lucas Silva and I, argue that there are a myriad of methods that are used to reconstruct environmental histories or environmental records that, when brought together with the Black geographies lens, create mechanisms to analyze the past, present, and future of this biophysical afterlife of slavery. They provide archives of the biophysical afterlife of slavery. The importance of such environmental science analysis in Black geographies is twofold. First, historical and present contamination information highlights that this experience of high concentrations of pollution and contamination is not just a right now issue, and it should not be approached as solely a right now issue. This is evidence of the perpetuation. We need to attend to the systemic and longstanding processes, both social and ecological, that brought and continue to bring the situation of disproportionate burden into being. And second, these biophysical archives have the potential to provide information about the ecological lives and experiences of racialized others who are often left out of conventional archives. They can be understood in combination with oral traditions and other subaltern forms of passing down these marginalized histories, providing a richness, but importantly, not occluding these traditions. Accessing these memories about the histories of racialized environmental violence is important. However, Black geographies asserts that Black life and Black spaces are not solely containers of violence, death, and degradation. Black geographies reminds us that landscapes do not exist as absolutes, and we scholars should not essentialize them as such. Indeed, Catherine McKittrick describes Black geographies as, quote, subaltern or alternative geographic patterns that work alongside and beyond traditional geographies and cite a terrain of struggle, end quote. Black geographies highlights the possibilities of etching out belonging in place, even within, alongside, and across spaces of domination and degradation. The biophysical landscape holding this contamination and degradation has survived in various ways. It is the materialization of the interwoven degradation and life that Black geographies highlights as possible or as present within subaltern communities. When I consider these trees, as well as the broader biophysical landscape as it relates to racial histories and their legacies, I want to ask, how can we understand biophysical landscapes as witnesses? Witnesses to the tragedies of anti-Black violence and ecological devastation, but also our mutual survival. I use our not only to attest to the survival of Black communities, but also these trees and ecologies. In order for me to go to this tree and examine its account of the past, it had to survive, drawing up water, elements, nutrients, and stories. Witnessing and mutually experiencing and remembering the ecological ramifications of the precarity and devaluation of Black life, but also our mutual survival. When thinking about these tree archives and the information they make available, I wonder about what Catherine McKittrick calls the what else happened. This question draws on analytical practice in Black studies to attend to Black life and subjectivity too often left out of traditional archives, but certainly happening. My dendrochemical analysis focuses on Port Arthur, Texas, a small Black coastal town nestled in what the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency calls the largest oil refinery network in the world, which includes the largest refinery in the Northern Hemisphere, the Motiva refinery, which is owned by Saudi Aramco, not us. My own family has generational ties to the city, with many still living there. My research draws on archives of Black ecological life, including my own lived experience, oral traditions, community members' oral histories, and community member family albums, to access and imagine what else happened in the mutual life of the trees that I study and the surrounding community. Black Port Arthur residents shared profound relationships to community, place, and environment, and all this thrived within the midst of decades of racial violence, environmental pollution, and intense climate change impacts. The limitations of traditional archives, science, and disciplinary modes of study preclude the finding of this Black life and sense of place within these cores, but it's there. These images that I share are somewhat of my imagining of the complexity and interwoven nature of life and death, past and present, across this landscape. So in this graphic, overlaid a high-resolution scan of one of my tree cores, are images representing the death-dealing reality of an environmental justice community, but also images representing life. Craftist method, especially in the work with Nia Jones and the Crafting Black Ecologies Collective, allows me to draw that complexity into my analysis of Black ecological life, as well as ecology itself, stressing the possibilities of knowing Black life differently, to use McKittrick's phrasing, when we work interdisciplinarily. There are a few other examples of this vein of work that stand out. For example, several archaeologists and community scientists with the organization Divers with a Purpose have integrated the science of archaeology and ocean conservation principles and practices with the work of honoring enslaved African ancestors lost in slave trade shipwrecks found in the depths of the ocean. This work has led not only to the discovery and honoring of ancestors at various slave trade shipwreck sites across the Atlantic, but also novel approaches to oceanic mapping and understandings of maroon geographies. Additionally, we can consider Suzanne Pierre and the Critical Ecology Lab, who are working to highlight the long-term impacts that slavery has had on soils and plant communities throughout the Black diaspora. These examples shed light on what it might look like to bring earnest engagements with critical approaches to histories and the present of Black subjugation, living, and struggle to environmental science and vice versa. The coalescing of Black geographies and CPG is fertile grounds for integrating deep understandings of various types of environmental sciences with rich understandings of racialized life and the histories that have shaped it. I want to encourage those of us concerned with racial justice in the environment to think about the ways critical approaches to environmental science can be woven into new, more just world-building practices embedded in and coming from subaltern communities. To conclude, I'd like to think on what are just geographies and perhaps what they're not. I find that Indigenous, decolonial, Black, and abolition geography scholars provide concise and clear language that gestures towards what just geographies are and what just geography could be. For example, Catherine McKittrick tells us, description is not liberation. Method making and method making that is rebellious and interdisciplinary can acknowledge and despise and critique degradation without sourcing it as the only way to know Black people. This is sort of method making that focuses on relationality. While McKittrick makes clear that description is not liberation, Michelle Daigle and Maggie Ramirez and their work on decolonial geographies remind us that, on the other hand, refusal is liberation, quote, through its resounding affirmation and embodiment of alternative relationalities, end quote. Again, we hear the importance of relation. Ruth Wilson Gilmore stresses that freedom is a place, and abolition is to quite literally change places. Gilmore states, abolition and abolition geographies work, quote, to destroy the geography of slavery and to abolish the processes of hierarchy, dispossession, and exclusion. And finally, decolonization is not a metaphor, and we must move away from those processes, practices, and methodologies that, quote, rescue settler futurity. And this reference is, of course, Eve Tuck and Wang Yang. So I lay out these provocations to lead to the question that I often sit with from Christina Sharp's In the Wake on Blackness and Being. How can we think, be, act, write, and research from here? In critical human geography, we are often asked to consider these aspects of more just world building as it relates to places and human subjects. But when we who take samples of soils, trees, animals, or install some measuring or monitoring site, how are we in good relation with those lands? and the caretakers of those lands, and the communities that surround us. What more can CPG do for racial justice than naming violence, if indeed description is not liberation, as McKittrick teaches us? How can we know Black ecological life differently? Can there be decolonized science within our settler colonial institutions that we work in? Talking about universities, just to be clear. If not, how can we do physical geography in, or at least in pursuit of, quote, good land relations, to quote Max Liboiron, in this meanwhile of New World building? In what ways can physical geography be a tool for abolition and decolonization? Thank you.
Hi. I'm Kelly Kay. I'm extremely honored and frankly more than a little nervous to be here speaking on this panel. So after Marilyn asked me to do this, oh yeah, I do need to change my slide. Okay. So after Marilyn asked me to do this, I began asking basically anyone and everyone for their thoughts on this topic, including literally calling a meeting with my graduate students. If I'm being honest, I think that one of the things that made me the most nervous about this is that I didn't want to come off as sugarcoating a difficult topic, as giving an authoritative take on what is unjust and how we can fix it, or implying that we may ever get to a place of a truly just discipline. I also found myself searching high and low and not knowing exactly where to begin in terms of laying out my own specific vision of justice. While racking my brain about this, my friend Levi recommended a wonderful piece from the Annals from 2017, where then AAG President Mona Domash tasked Josh Barkin and Laura Polito with this exchange of like they're writing each other letters, considering the relationship between geography, their work, and their own formulations of justice. The exchange begins with Laura Polito writing, "Dear Josh, so Mona has given us the daunting task of discussing justice." Sound familiar? I agreed to it thinking, sounds like fun. But as I peel back the layers of justice, I realize I have far more questions and uncertainties than answers. And unlike some of our colleagues who seem to have much greater command of their fields, one thing I realized was that, unlike you, I don't engage with justice on a theoretical level. Indeed, I initially felt like a fraud speaking on the topic. But I realized quickly that justice has been central to all of my work. Though I may not know what justice is, I have a clear sense of what it is not. I was honestly relieved to see that somebody as eminent and admirable as Laura Polito also initially felt like a fraud when asked to speak about justice. And I think that the thing that I appreciated so much about this exchange was that the discussion of justice for these two folks was so deeply situated in a discussion of the authors' life experiences, research, and engagements inside and outside the academy. So I too want to speak from a particular place today as a means of anchoring my thoughts. So what I want to do in my limited time here today is to think about how we work towards building just geographies in the institutional contexts within which we are situated as scholars. Both geographers and geographies are made and remade in the university, the place where we work, and where we train graduate and undergraduate students to become a new generation of geographers themselves. Given that fact, I'm gonna focus on three topics today that I see as very important considerations for moving closer toward just geographies. First, I wanna speak briefly about the teaching of geography's history and our canon. Then I want to talk about the recent strikes at the University of California and other campuses, with these strikes focusing on graduate student and postdoctoral researcher precarity. And finally, I will close by discussing the making of a more just discipline through our engagements as mentors to our students. So last year, I took over my department's grad level history of geography course and really struggled to pull together a syllabus that managed to walk the very tight line of representing the discipline's problematic histories of colonialism, racism, and empire without giving the impression that these are problems that have been left in the past. I felt it was necessary for students to gain knowledge of major currents and debates in the discipline, and to know about historical figures like Mackinder, Huntington, and Ratzel, who do loom large. As instructors, there's a lot that we can do to reconsider how we structure these syllabi and how we tell these stories. Eden Kincaid and Lauren Fritcha just published actually a great paper in the Annals about this, about the role of our syllabi in reproducing our discipline. And they provide some really insightful and concrete ideas about how one might revamp their syllabi to work towards more inclusive and diverse approaches to teaching the history of our fields. And there have been a number of things this AAG on this topic, which has been really exciting. I think that the one that's coming up, if anyone's wanting to think through these things, is on Sunday. There's a panel at 8:30 on building more just geography graduate programs, so something to consider. So one of the things that I found really hard about trying to tell geography's history differently through my own syllabus is that while there have been a number of really wonderful articles in recent years raising really important points about geography's blind spots or its imperial and colonial present, the textbooks that tend to form the backbone of these types of courses are absolutely not keeping pace. As instructors, we rely on anthologies, historical geographies of our field, and key concepts texts to help our students slog through a very long and dense history. I cannot overstate how glad I personally am that these texts exist and that I can lean on them for teaching, but they really do tend to lack quite a lot of diversity within their authorship. So I really think, yes, we need interventions and we need articles, but we really need large authoritative texts. And I hope as a collective that we can move towards pulling together these types of textbooks, handbooks, and anthologies so that these can become key works for teaching the next generation of geographers about our discipline. Okay, so my second point. Our universities are communities of scholars, but they are also workplaces. The past few years have seen a fount of unionization efforts and labor disputes at a range of campuses around our country, including at Clark University, Temple, Yale, the University of New Mexico, USC, NYU, and Columbia. Close to home for me personally was the strike by graduate students, postdocs, and other academic researchers at the University of California, where 48,000 workers participated in the largest higher education strike in US history. These strikes did not appear out of thin air, but instead they arose after decades of declining real wages for some of our university's most necessary and most precarious workers. Our teaching assistants and postdocs are striking en masse because the chasm between the work that we ask them to do and the compensation that we provide for them to do that work has become far too large to bear. I believe that we cannot have a just society if that society suffers from extreme income inequality, and I think the same applies to geography and our discussions about justice in our discipline. So as mentioned, I called a meeting with my students, and in our discussion, one of them brought up the critical point that geography has long been and will likely continue to be primarily a public university discipline. Training graduate students in public universities means that those students are not likely to be on fellowships, but will almost always be working for wages and tuition remission in our classrooms, in our labs, and on our research projects. Given that so many of our public universities have restructured over the course of decades to rely more and more heavily on our most precarious workers, adjuncts, temporary lecturers, and graduate students, I think this point about labor conditions and just geographies is particularly salient. How can we speak about the need to move towards a more just discipline when many of our students are struggling to afford housing, food, medicine, and other essential needs? Where our adjunct colleagues are compensated a fraction of the amount that our tenured and tenure-track colleagues are, often for providing the essential teaching that helps our institutions to deliver their required educational missions. If a more just discipline is our aim, those of us who have the security to do so need to speak up and put in the work to make sure that not only our students, but also our non-tenure-track colleagues are not being faced with extreme precarity. Okay, and then last thing, I want to speak about mentorship, though in some respects that topic is woven through everything I've discussed thus far. So as mentioned, I've got a pretty large and lovely crew of grad students at the moment. I see some of you out there. And walking alongside them, metaphorically speaking, as they work to become geographers in their own right is one of my biggest priorities in my job. I was a first-generation college graduate and honestly had no idea how the university worked when I arrived. Our institutions are accretions of norms and tacit knowledge that are crucial to know for our success, but exceedingly hard to learn if you do not know where to look. As I said earlier, as I was trying to figure out what to say on this panel, I literally called a meeting with my students because I wanted to be able to include their perspectives as well on how we can align our mentorship with the furthering, but futuring works too, of more just geographies. One comment that was made early on that really resonated with me was that, quote, justice is produced in situated relationships between people. That is to say that through our mentoring and colleague relationships, through having difficult conversations, modeling good behavior, and treating one another well, we literally produce and reproduce geographies that are just or not. It sounds simple, but obviously, changing the ways that we work and relate to one another is no small task. But it's also not something that we can change overnight. But geography is a community of people, and if those people commit to working every day to doing things differently, then things will change, albeit likely very slowly. Last thing I want to say, another theme that arose for me when talking with my students about just geographies is that justice in I think one of them said this phrase, justice in mentoring is about teaching your students what they need to know to get where they need to go. One of my students who's from South America talked about how early on in her career, she was told that she would probably have to work twice as hard as everyone else, and that she had accepted that. But what that work actually entails is not always easily legible, especially to students coming from non-Western contexts. She mentioned how critical it was to see how a proposal is structured, how to put together a journal article, or how to write a reviewer response letter. In this very quotidian context, even, oh my gosh, I've lost my place, even thinking to share these kinds of materials with our students, either materials that are our own or which we see as good examples, is critical for ensuring that our students who may not have extensive training in the norms of academia are able to thrive and succeed. I know it sounds so mundane, but honestly, if we want to diversify our discipline, if we want to work towards more just geographies, then we need to ensure that our students who are first gen, working class, international, or otherwise from groups that have historically been marginalized are empowered with the same hidden toolbox that may give students from more privileged backgrounds a leg up in getting grants, awards, and eventually jobs. Our mentorship matters for how justice arises or does not in our discipline. And I urge everyone to consider the practices they employ in advising and mentoring and how they might be altered to even the playing field, however that ultimately looks for you and your students. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Guillermo, Tianna, and Kelly. You've had a lot of wonderful ideas, concepts displayed. Do you have any questions for our panelists? I'm going to say you've been overwhelmed with what you've heard. But be brave. Lisa?
I'll open the floor. I work for AAG, so this is informed by that. I often wonder, it's almost like you have to travel two tracks, right? Because you're trying to figure out how to make the world a more just place or a little part of the world. And you're also trying to figure out how to make, how to push the discipline in a more just direction. So we're like, are we talking about geography, the discipline? Geography, the knowledge of place? And so I'd love to hear you talk about how you switch back and forth between those questions for yourselves.
You can.
I think I can do it. So that's a great question. As I think about what does it take to navigate those two spheres of the discipline and the concept, I think about Gloria Anzaldúa, who in her posthumously published book, Luz en lo Oscuro, described the way that we transmit the ideas that are in our head to someone else. So we have to imagine justice. We have to imagine what our discipline is, what the concepts are. And we have to reimagine that and then think about how do we shape that to others. And it's hard. I wish I had an answer. But all I can say is that where I draw strength is knowing that folks like you all in this room, the folks who are in my classes, the folks who I work with, we are engaged in the process and the practice of reimagining both the discipline and the concept.
All right. Yeah, thanks so much for that question. At least when it comes to my current research, because the work that I want to see from academia and the family I go home to see, that's the same. It's the community that I'm talking about is my family. It's my life, and it's a real place. Sorry, I didn't mean to give that piece. It's a real place. But I say that to mean that doing work better in academia, what does it matter if we're not making a better world? That's sort of what I'm hoping to happen. That's kind of the end of it. Things can be better in our workplaces. Of course, things can be better. And our workplaces are also the real, not to talk about workplaces, but within our discipline. I think if things get better in the discipline and we aren't transmitting that into real world things, what's the purpose? Is sort of at least where I'm at right now. So thank you for the question.
I don't know if I have anything to add, actually. I really like what both of you said.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? Come to the...
Oh, that was so wonderful. Yeah. My question is primarily, I guess, for Tianna, but welcome to panelists. Tianna, I'm reflecting on there's also barriers, institutional barriers to integrating the kinds of approaches you're integrating so powerfully. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on the kind of just pedagogies or institutional reforms necessary to enable the kind of integrations you're thinking about. And that's a big question. So it's really, are there resonances with the other panelists that inspire you in this direction, or however you want to take that question?
I think it was breaking up a little bit, but I think I got it.
The connections between just pedagogies, institutional change, and bringing together this sort of critical analysis of biophysical landscapes.
Yeah, there's I think a lot of CPG's work talks about these barriers getting funded when you're doing a project that's so heavily scientific, so heavily environmental science, and then so heavily social science, and getting reviewers that are able to evaluate both of these things and say that it's good or not. And so then losing out on funding because it's just too complicated or something. That's a very clear barrier that's often covered in CPG work, but also having all of that knowledge in one head too is a lot. And so there's like a barrier of like being trained in physical geography and being trained in critical human geography. In my approach, for example, when I teach political ecology, I try to have very clear examples of this is what the science looks like when it comes to like trees or something like that, and this is what it matters for communities, and have like both of those in a week and see where it goes. Sometimes students don't care about one and they care about the other. Sometimes they care about both, and there's a surprising amount of excitement about this sort of work that brings together what we're talking about in physical geography and what we're talking about in critical human geography. So if there's any sort of thought about there not being an audience or not being reception for it, I would say it's misplaced. Yeah, yeah, so there's the teaching and there's the actual doing of it. I also, at least originally, was trying to do all of it myself. That was a failure, I mean, not a failure, but that was a mistake. So I am heavily leaning into collaborations and all that collaborations can bring to the work that I'm trying to do, especially thinking diasporically, because I'm talking about Black geographies, and that's not just a US thing. So how can we think about all of this? How can building collaborations also enrich what we're studying? I don't know where you went, but I think I answered that question. Any?
One from the audience. So, despite many critical theories cited, how geographies might better consider, actually, yeah, I was supposed to hand this up to you, Marilyn. I blew it. Do you want it?
Go ahead.
Sorry. Despite many critical theories cited, how geographies might better consider and stand up for other species has not been mentioned tonight. As we move toward a more inclusive discipline, can you speak to how non-humanity is included in Just Geographies? I would add a little note that I felt trees deeply as you spoke of them, so.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, yeah. So at least I appreciate that point for sure. And I really try to talk about the mutual experience of the biophysical world and racialized peoples, to highlight that everything that we decide to do to each other, we are also deciding to do to the places that are around us, the landscapes around us. Yeah, but I also think there can definitely be a more centrally, I think answering some of those questions at the end that I positioned would inherently bring, I think, thinking about more than human kin within our work more explicitly. At least that's what I envision. Who knows what will happen, but that's what I envision.
Yeah, I absolutely don't feel like I'm the person to speak about this necessarily, but I just feel like there's so many other kinds of ontologies, indigenous worldviews, and other things that recognize that just have a different way of seeing geographies, of seeing the world, that don't maintain that separation, right, between our non-human humans. And so I guess I put that forward just to say that I think that there are all sorts of ways of thinking through this, right, and that there are plenty of approaches that many geographers are employing that recognize the fact that it would be impossible to think about justice for humans without thinking about justice for more than humans as well.
I'll just add that, from my perspective, I'm trained as a social scientist, interdisciplinary scholar, focus on the urban, and I don't encounter the non-human world as much in my work, and yet I made my class an introduction to social and ecological justice. Yes. I do that because I want to invite students to come in with that perspective and to teach me and to create a space where I can, work with them. I can't know everything, and I think as an intro class, there's often that tension of like, what do we reveal? Where do we point people? And there's so many places to go. And I was, just stuck not knowing how to do this the right way. And I decided there isn't a right way. And so I left it open and open-ended for my students to take it where they needed to go. And so I think where I do it in my practice is creating a space where folks can feel they belong in this space, thinking about critically about justice, even if it's not hitting the humans directly. So that's where I go in that.
Hello. I have a quick question. Was there a body of research or maybe a framework that you all use that we can refer to define just geographies?
I like how they just figure out who talks first.
Heard the question.
Is there a body of
I don't know why, I just feel so frozen today. I'm so sorry. I feel like I'm not normally.
I can, okay.
I'll take this because I draw on so many fields and disciplines. Critical GIS is a whole field in and itself. Health equity, environmental justice, science and technology studies. There's so many different bodies of work that I've engaged with, and I've had to bring them together in ways that don't make sense the first time around. But I think where that can take you is it's everywhere. And start from where you are and what you're interested in and build from that. You'll encounter others having thought the same thing you did, because the strive for justice has been since humans have started. You know, we've always been looking for I will just say it is innate that we seek justice. We continue to produce injustices. And so we have theorized and thought about how to make justice in action in our world. And so those are those specific fields that I've engaged with that have theoretically framing around justice. I think it's in everything that it's so vast.
Yeah. I agree with everything that Guillermo said. For me, the specific disciplines are, of course, Black geographies, because that's sort of where I'm positioned, and that's what really shifted my way of understanding justice in my own world. So Black geographies, for sure, for me. But I also am pushing myself, and I want to push all of us to think about how all of these different critical human geographies or other geographies, to use Nyla Austin's word, can speak to each other. So indigenous geographies, decolonial geographies, abolition geographies, which is not always the same as Black geographies, but also Korean trans geographies, and there's so many others, I keep just hitting others, so many areas in geography that are doing great work on just geographies, for sure. And I think each of them has its own distinct interventions that not only stand alone, but also speak well together to coalesce into a new world that we want to build, right? Yeah, but then, so there's the bodies of literature, but then there's activists, and there's everyday life, and there's people in your community that have their own, visions of justice that are equally as valid, which is in itself something I'm drawing from all these other literatures that I'm talking about. Yeah, so there's just sort of piggybacking on what Guillermo said, there's so many spaces, and there's definitely a lot of work in geography.
Okay, sorry, I don't know why I'm totally blanking. I've said this at the beginning, I think I'm just extremely nervous to be here, so just being vulnerable, I guess. A lot of my training is in radical and critical political economy, and I think that that's a lot of what brought me to thinking about justice and geography, and that's sort of the core that I'm often drawing on, though increasingly, my work is on land and property, and I think understanding law and other kinds of relations of property, as particularly alongside things like racial capitalism, is really helpful for understanding how the spaces and places around us are being made by capitalism, but also through all sorts of legal and other institutional means. I mean, I feel like it's slightly different. Everybody's coming from their own place, but yeah, that's a lot of what I've always drawn on and the work that I have come up in.
Hey, I just want to thank you guys. This has been such a wonderful talk. It brought back a lot of thoughts I had, a lot of work that I did as a master's student at Georgia State back in 2012. I have a chapter called A Just GIS. And I remember when I wrote that, I didn't have the maturity that I have now as Dr. D. Jordan, but then it was written with such trepidation because I was actually taking on and challenging the status quo in GIS and
who and what gets to participate in GIS, who produces this knowledge, and how do we disrupt the status quo and allow geography to be more equitable for the communities who it's their life, their lived experience that we're visualizing. And so today made me quite happy to see that there's now a course where this justness of GIS can be practiced and can, new scholars can be trained in that space. I think the notion of having just geographies at the forefront, I remember when my voice was a lot lower and I would shake a little bit when I spoke. The title of my thesis, my master's thesis, was Exploring the Use of GIS as a Social and Environmental Justice Advocacy Tool for Community-Based Organizations. And the title, because the word justice was in the title, there was contention amongst my committee members. And it was my chair, my committee chair, who is now the chair of the geography department at Georgia State University, Dr. Catherine Hankins, who told the other voices to sit still, that we were going to go forward with the title. We were not going to change the title because interrogating those narratives is exactly what a true geographer should be doing. So I thank you for such a wonderful panel.
Can I get your name? I want to read your work. I need to read your work. I need to include this in my class. I will say that I looked on various search engines back in 2017 and 18, and I didn't see anything. So I'm so grateful that you are presenting, that you thought about this. I know that one of the things with doing this kind of work is we all kind of come to a sense of justice, and we find out, yeah, others have thought about it before you. And so it's validating to know that there have been folks who've literally used the same term, but I want to include your work in my class, please. Come back later.
Kelly, your last comment sparked a question from me. I'm also in economic geography and specifically policing. And for me, actionability is a very important thing, and public-facing work is a very important thing. I wanted to just ask the three of you, what are the opportunities for just thinking just geographies in a public-facing or popular education context?
We can't be up here and not acknowledge what's happening in this country. The increasingly rise of anti-queer, anti-trans, anti-woman, anti-black, anti-Latinx, anti-Asian, all the ways that these laws that are coming in, and they actually are coming into academia, the ways that critical race theory has been weaponized as something that's some imagined boogeyman that is being stripped out of schools, which is really a way of cementing whiteness in our public schools. I'm fortunate I'm in a private institution in California, in Los Angeles, with a very progressive faculty and mostly progressive trustees. I'm gonna be honest, okay? I'm not tenured, but you know what? That's fine. It's real. The thing is, I feel very privileged in where I am, and so I will speak out. And I know there are so many that can't, because they will lose their livelihoods. And it gives me so much anger, sadness, fear. And so this is why it is essential that we act as a community, and those of us who are in these positions to speak out, to challenge those forces of oppression, so that one day, folks at institutions that are in states and in localities that are trying to enshrine these oppressions in laws and in ways of thinking, because I'm a critical pedagogist by reading a lot and by engaging with folks. And Paulo Freire, who's one of the foundational people in critical pedagogy, talks about how the power of legibility, of reading, of literacy, and it's not just reading the written word, but it's reading our world around us. And that is being stripped out of our students in our schools. And that's threatening how we can achieve a more just geography. more just world? And I don't have an answer other than just we need to work together and acknowledge where those threats are coming from and do what we can as institutions like the AAG, which is a very big organization. We can make demands, perhaps. And we ask the AAG, can we demand that I think we've had a letter, we've written up on this, right? I think I've seen those. So continue to press our institutions that we're in to demand that we don't tolerate, that we can't tolerate the mischaracterization, the complete lie of to the people who are proposing to strip away these kinds of knowledges that we're trying to create. So, I don't know, it would be more articulate, but it's just, yeah. That's all.
I think I have a very different scale. I was going to respond about sort of in my own work, places where I think it would be possible to intervene. To my fellow economic geographer, thanks. Yeah, so my work right now is on timberland investment, many pension funds and university endowments. I mean, I think this is a familiar tale in terms of things like land grabbing of land in the global south, but nearly every timber-dependent community in the United States is primarily owned by investor owners now. This is causing all sorts of issues around having tons and tons of absentee owners who are changing the norms of access and ownership in these places. So to the question of what can we do, one of the things that I think is really interesting or an important lever that's come up through my own work, sort of digging into these financial questions, is many of us are at institutions that have endowments or pension funds that are invested in green portfolio options that are not particularly green or just for communities not, I mean, the communities I study are in the rural US, but in places all around the world, right? And so I think that's one example of the ways that things that might seem really theoretical, like doing economic geography work on finance, might actually lead to like concrete levers that we could pull. Similarly, I was telling someone the story earlier today. I got asked by the IRS to be an expert witness in like tax fraud cases in which rich people are taking advantage of tax incentives that I study, right? So there are all sorts of ways that, I mean, this is such a different response than Guillermo, right? But there are all sorts of ways that through our expertise, we can intervene in things that are concerning or that we see as unjust. Sometimes even in our own institutions, right? With asking questions about what is my pension invested in, for example.
I really like what both of y'all said, so I'll just briefly say, I guess I think about that last question, like how is our work in good relation with the communities around us? How is it in good relation with the caretakers of the land? There's a lot that people might want you to do that could be helpful for them, that if you aren't in good relation or there's no relation, you're missing out on opportunities for public-facing work. I mean, just like providing the findings of this tree stuff was like a pretty big deal to the Parks and Rec Department, the Port Arthur Parks and Recreation Department. Too many P's. Yeah, so there's just, I think building those relations is like a really strong avenue to learn more about what you can do or what people want you to do, or, maybe it's later on down the line, you'll have a splash. But, I think that's a first step.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone have a question?
If I may, hi. I really quickly, I promise I'll get to a question, but I do want to quickly thank you all for your talks. This was the best plenary I've been to at an AAG. And I also want to quickly affirm the contribution that y'all specifically are already making towards building a Just Geographies. Tianna, I haven't met you yet, but your presentation was fantastic. But I am fortunate to have been able to be around and in spaces with everyone else up on that stage. And I don't know if y'all even recognize the impact you have by bringing your full, authentic, vulnerable selves to these spaces that we're in. I've learned from literally each of you, even if I haven't told you. But one gem that I'll say Guillermo has dropped just in casual conversation is to look for a rhythm rather than a balance. So when you're overwhelmed, try and find a rhythm instead of looking for this equilibrium balance that you're trying to find. And so I guess I'm curious how you all try and find your rhythm while doing this daily work that you all are clearly committed to doing to trying to build a more just geographies.
I think just taking care of yourself as much as you can, and I know this sounds like easier, it's very much easier said than done, right? But recognizing, I mean, I don't know, like, I think, well, Flavia, I know as a grad student, right, you're like pushed to work all the time, work so hard all the time, and I don't think that that ultimately yields the kind of results that you might necessarily think. I think it's really important to just, I don't know, honestly, I've tried as hard as I can over the past few years to basically maintain as close as is reasonable to like a regular working person's 9 to 5 schedule. It's not always doable, it's very hard, but like, yeah, I mean, we can't just like grind ourselves into the ground, and people need to relax and have fun and have friends. I have a dog who I really love. I don't know, I mean, I think just, yeah, really trying to recognize that if you want to be able to be available and kind and helpful, like you can't just be burned, like so crazy burned out all the time. And it's not worth it. It's not worth it to, you know, totally wreck your health or your life or your relationships. So that's my 2 cents. Oh wait, I was going for balance, not rhythm.
You know what, I'll let you go first,
Okay.
yeah.
So, I love to dance.
Yes.
That's where the rhythm comes from. And also, I don't have the core strength to stay balanced. Okay, that's my little thing. What it means for me is that I need to recognize when I need to step back. And there are certainly times when I take on more than I probably can handle at the moment. And I find that I get energized by being of service to others, to the communities that I engage with, to my students, to my partner, to, you know, to others. And I will admit, it doesn't yield a high production of publications. It doesn't. I'm at a liberal arts college. Perhaps I'll have slightly less of a demand for that big H factor, N factor, whatever, H factor. But I'm committed to where that change, that transformative change can happen. And I so strongly believe it's that starting at the smallest scales, at the interpersonal scale, in our small classrooms, that's where I want to invest my energies. And in doing that work, I have found both the way that I can frame my work that will go towards publication, that maybe will satisfy some folk. But I'm at a particular point where I'm okay if this doesn't work out for me. Just being honest here. Because that's not my goal. My goal is not tenure. Tenure would be a cool tool, and it could allow me to do a lot more. But that's not my goal. And I don't say this to tell everybody, get away from, but I just know that I was very unhappy, feeling that there was some, bar that I had to reach that just kept seeming unattainable, because it was completely contradictory to my soul. And I've had to find that rhythm. And I will admit, there are times where I kind of lose step, and it's folks like you, Flavia, who literally helped me to get my rhythm back. So I don't have a great, it's do X, Y, and Z, because I don't actually believe that there is steps that we can teach, because I'm not the kind of, steps kind of dancer. I like the, yay, I like dance music. I love to just move my body. And when I find that joy and I can be in sync with others, that's how I feel. And so there's nothing tangible there, but it is palpable. And I think when you find that, just kind of lean on your co-conspirators, let them lift you up. And I will admit, I don't always do that. But I'm so grateful for you all here. And I sense that I can lean on folks. And like this, you know, this experience at this AAG, I spent a lot of effort with my students. I have badges that I have like 30,000 little slips because I was doing a lot. And I've seen just the fruits of that in my students' presentations, in their posters, in, you know, our LXG work. And it fulfills me so much. And so I will reflect on this and write this up because we'll get that published somewhere. But that's where I'm at in terms of like trying to get that rhythm.
Again, y'all just saying great things. Yeah, I mean, to be honest and vulnerable, I'm probably out of balance and out of rhythm right now. Really tired and giving up maybe too much to work. So I'm not in that space where I'm like fully, you know, Celia Cruz moving in the rhythm or like Zen balance. I'm just not there right now. But I think when I particularly hit a far swing of being out of rhythm and out of balance, for example, when a lot of my work is trying to foreground Black life and environmental justice communities, and I like get another call that another family member has died in Port Arthur or something, and that's like, I'm like angry, so angry, angry at like that I feel like maybe academic work doesn't do a lot for like this day-to-day life of being in an EJ community. Angry that it takes so much work to just explain like that there is Black life. Just angry at so many things. And what pulls me back in is definitely being in community, like not even just academic community, but just community with friends and such too. But also, I have work outside of academia that I feel like moves towards decolonization and abolition. And I think that work, that has nothing to do with, I intentionally don't researchize, that's what I call it. I don't researchize those spaces. I don't researchize that work. I'm not there to extract from these relationships that I'm building. That's just like life-giving work, and that's places where and it's like with the land, it's like outside, and it's with Indigenous peoples. And I feel like it's like it gives me life whenever I'm like, there's none. Yeah, so I think community in the broad sense, of course we need community in our academic spaces, we need community in our friends and connections that we have, but also finding places to give work and give ourselves and also be fed outside of academic spaces, really what's doing it for me.
Okay, thank you. I'll take this opportunity to thank our three panelists for really thought-provoking presentations and beautiful answers to the questions that you have. I am a physical geographer with just dabbling in this. So dabbling, that's the wrong word. I'm really vested in this and trying to see how what I do can move my geography and my discipline, for the person who asked, towards a much more just geography. And this is a start. It is more than a start. And I thank you for your efforts today. So. And thank you, the audience, for coming and sitting and being engaged. We will continue the conversation. Remember, look for that space next to the AAG registration and beginning tomorrow. Thanks.